our latest research shows that about 66% of people who say that they are living with a mental health problem, and that's self-diagnosed, not necessarily just a clinical diagnosis, they say that they're feeling anxious about how much they owe on credit. And every year, the Money and Pension Service run this week, Talk Money Week, to try to encourage people to talk about money. And again, let's think about the parallels there with mental health. When I first started working in the mental health sector, people didn't talk about it. There was huge amount of stigma and shame to talk about mental health. I would say it's probably not perfect now, but we've definitely made some huge strides with campaigns like anti-stigma campaigns like Time to Change. But there still seems to be a bit of a stigma around talking about money. So we really want to encourage people to talk about money. And today, that's one of the things I want to do to talk to you about today. So we're going to cover off some of the links between mental health and money, both in terms of what the data is telling us about the scale of the problem, but also a bit about why these two things seem to be so inextricably linked. And then the important part, what can we all do about it? And I'm going to share some tools and resources that I hope will be able to help you to help others and potentially help yourself as well, because this isn't something that's just happening to people over there. We all have mental health. We all have to deal with money, and sometimes our mental health may not be so good, and sometimes our money situation may not be so good. So this is something that's universal. It's not just happening to people over there. So first of all, some statistics. So as I mentioned, at the Money and Pension Service, we conduct a whole load of different bits of research and insight gathering. And in 2021, we conducted something called an Adult Financial Wellbeing Survey. So this is a huge survey. It went out to over 10,000 people across the UK. And we asked a range of questions, both about that person's own particular circumstances, personal circumstances, and also a range of questions about how they feel and how they can manage money. One of the questions that we asked was around whether people were struggling to keep up with bills or payments. Now, the UK average, in terms of the answer to that question, was that 50% of people said that they were struggling to keep up with bills and payments. 50%, half, which is mind-blowing in itself. The figure for just London, so the London average was 60%, so 10% more people were struggling with to keep up with bills and payments. But we also asked people whether they had experienced a mental health problem within the last 3 years. And if we look at that group, the figure jumps up yet again. So for the group of people who have experienced a mental health problem, 74% of them were struggling with bills and payments. And again, the London specific data is high once again. 76% of people who experience a mental health problem are also struggling to keep up with bills and payments. So that's showing us that there's a link one way or another there. Is it that someone is struggling with bills and payments and that means they're struggling with their mental health, or is it the other way around? The data doesn't tell us cause and effect, but what it shows us is that it's a huge chunk of people that are affected by both of these issues. We also know that half of people who are in problem debt also have a mental health problem. Now, by problem debt, we mean that someone's actually fallen behind with a bill or payment. So they're not just struggling with it, they've actually fallen behind, they're in arrears. It might be that they've fallen behind on their rent, so that there's a risk to losing their home, or their mortgage is the same risk. If they've fallen behind with their council tax, some councils use bailiffs to try to get the money back, which is pretty frightening. Or credit cards or loans. And generally with those kinds of debts, the creditors are calling, they're texting, they're demanding the payments back. So it's not surprising when you think about that pressure that if that 50% of people who are in problem debt also experience a mental health problem. Now, the next figure comes from a survey that we've done just recently on the run-up to Talk Money Week. And we asked people whether or not they avoided talking about money. And this was across the UK. Bit of a smaller sample than our full adult financial wellbeing survey. Now, the UK average for this was 81%. So 81% of UK adults have told us they avoid talking about money. But when, again, we look at that data for the people who've also said that they experience a mental health problem, it shoots up to 91%. So the picture that we're starting to paint here is that struggling with bills and payments, falling behind and into debt, and mental health problems are really closely linked, and it's actually affecting quite a big chunk of the population, both here in London and across the UK. But worryingly, people aren't talking about it. They're not talking about money. And again, from a mental health perspective, we know that not talking about how we're feeling, not talking about our concerns, can often lead to quite serious mental health issues. And it's the same, it's those parallels again. Talking about money is important because there is help out there, but the earlier that you can get that help, the better. Because if we move on to the last statistic there, although it's the smallest figure, it's probably the scariest, isn't it? So we know that 13% of people who are in problem debt have thought about suicide. And although it's the smallest number, any number when we're talking about suicide is you know, a scary number and is too high. And again, it's not surprising if people get to that point where they feel so hopeless and that there's no way out and that the money problem is just so overwhelming, then they've reached that point where they are contemplating suicide. So although that's a stark picture in terms of the stats, what it doesn't go into in a lot of detail is perhaps, well, why are these two things so closely linked? So again, from my experience, and there's many of you on the call and may have your own experiences, so do share if it's appropriate to do so in the chat. I've worked with people who've come to me, and by the time they've come to me, both their mental health and their money problem is in a real crisis situation. And when I've worked with that person and I've explored what's gone on, they kind of enter this vicious cycle of mental health and money problems from both sides. I've worked with people who've experienced it from both sides. If we take entering it from the money problem first, oftentimes someone is ticking along in life absolutely fine, and then something will happen which comes out of the blue, that unexpectedness that we talked about earlier, which knocks them off course financially. So it might be a relationship breakdown or a bereavement. And in both of those situations, whereas they might have had two incomes coming into the household and that was covering the bills quite nicely, if that goes down to one income coming into the household, your outgoings don't half. You've still got you know, full rent to pay or full mortgage to pay, for example. So that really puts a squeeze on people's money situation and can start to trigger a money problem. Losing your job, redundancy, perhaps having to take time off because of ill health, fluctuating income, particularly for people who are self-employed. All of these things can cause a money problem. And at the moment, with cost of living, what we're seeing isn't so much an income issue, a loss of income. What we're seeing is increased costs. And that's meaning that people have got really difficult decisions that they're having to make about what they spend their money on. And as I mentioned earlier, having a money problem is stressful. You don't know what's going to happen next. You're constantly having to question, you know, what will I do with the money that I have? How do I spread it around and pay everybody when I don't have enough money to pay everybody? Does it mean that I don't eat? Does it mean that I don't put the heating on? And that is a very stressful way to live. And again, for those of you on the call who might have done some mental health awareness training or indeed are mental health professionals, you've probably heard of the stress bucket. If not, very quickly, the stress bucket is an idea that we all have our own stress buckets, and they're sort of different shapes and sizes. And all of us in life have stresses that rain down into our stress bucket. It might be relationship stress, work stress, financial stress. And if that stress is raining into our buckets and the bucket is getting increasingly full, if it gets to that point where the bucket overflows, then that's when we can start to tip into potentially having a mental health problem. Usually with the stress bucket, when we're talking about mental health, we talk about needing to have holes or taps in the bottom of the bucket to release the stress. And sometimes that includes doing activities that are good for our well-being. And if all of those stresses are money stresses, then my suggestion is the tap is some sort of support and guidance or advice for the money problem. So it's not difficult to see why money problems have that increased stress and then can tip round into someone having a mental health problem. But equally, on the other side, I've worked with people where they are perhaps living with a mental health condition or a diagnosed mental illness. And obviously, conditions affect people in different ways, symptoms affect people in different ways. So I'm not suggesting that there's a one size fits all here. It's very personal. But just as some examples, I've worked with people who are experiencing anxiety, different symptoms of anxiety. And for some people that can make making decisions very difficult because they're questioning all the time whether they're making the right decision, and it almost paralyzes them so that they can't make a decision. And sometimes that means they can't make a decision about a money issue, in which case a money problem happens and there they are in that cycle. Similarly with depression, if someone's experiencing low mood, it can be very difficult for them to have motivation to make a decision or to deal with financial problems or issues. I've also worked with people where they've bought gifts when they've had that very low mood, often for other people, because that's made them feel better. But perhaps they've not been able to afford those gifts and it's caused a money problem. For some people with conditions such as bipolar disorder or emotionally unstable personality disorder, that can often mean that there's a lack of impulse control. Again, not in everybody, but in some clients that I've worked with. And again, some examples of people that I've helped where they've bought clothing, sometimes it's clothing that they've not been able to afford when they were perhaps in a manic phase. Somebody that I worked with had bought a sports car. Someone I'd worked with had actually given all of their money away during a manic phase, all of the cash that they had in their bank. And when they came out of that phase and into a depressive phase, the guilt, the shame, the embarrassment of what they had done was really possibly worse for them, is what they told me, than when they were in that manic phase. And again, it means that they've got a money problem, they've got this debt or they don't have any money, which has caused an issue, and they've also perhaps got those feelings where they just can't deal with it. And for other conditions like schizophrenia, that can make sometimes actually the side effects of medication are worse for people than the condition. But in terms of money, that can sometimes make making decisions about money more difficult. Again, I've worked with people where that what we might think is like a linear thought process, and being able to say, oh, well, if my money comes in on a Monday, if I spend it all on a Tuesday, I'm not going to have any left Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Sometimes that sort of thought process didn't quite work, and people were often left without money for days when I was working with some clients in that position. So it's not hard to see when we think about it that way how people can get into this mental health problem and money problem cycle. And just with mental health problems, people often need support. Same with money problems. And from my experience, people really need a bit of a pincer approach. So if they are struggling with both their mental health and a money problem, they need support from both angles. So both support for their mental health and for their money, and that will often give the best outcome.